welcome. What I'm going to talk about tonight is a specific federal funding program for product development, research and development that's being done specifically by small businesses. This program's called SBIR and STTR. Like I said, it is federal funding for small businesses. And you already probably know this, but my name's Leon Wolf. I am an inventor. I'm a chemical engineer. I work in support of people doing SBIR and STTR proposals. And most of my time is contracted through Oregon Best. I'm a grant writer in that role, and they provide my services free of charge to qualifying small businesses anywhere in Oregon. And I also work privately on SBIR and other technology-based grants. So thanks. I heard a gentleman say that all inventors are rich a little bit earlier. Was that you, Bob?
No, I know the other Bob.
Okay, it just reminded me of a joke. Is how do you get an inventor to make a small fortune with his idea?
Start with a big one.
Say that louder, please.
Yeah, start with a big one.
Exactly. So you all know it takes money to kind of develop products, get testing, and find talent to work on things. And it's not always easy to get that funding. So the SBIR and STTR programs, which stand for Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer, as the earlier slide mentioned, it's the United States government's way of having a seed fund for innovation that large companies and universities aren't doing. And between a number of different federal agencies, they provide over almost $3 billion in federal grants and contracts to fund development of innovative technologies, with the idea that they're seeding innovation and creating jobs and revenue and economic value in the U.S. So there's a huge amount to learn about the program. I'll mention this again at the end, but if you go to www.sbir.gov, this is the Fed's governmental website, and it has links to all of the agency, history of the program, tutorials that you can train on, and there's just simply not enough time for me to really go into all this depth. I'll probably be talking for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. So there's dozens and dozens of pages of information on that website that if you're curious about and want to follow up with, you should look at that page. I should mention that there'll be plenty of time for questions, and I don't have to be anywhere after this except dinner. Because Zoom is kind of finicky, if we could save the questions for the end, unless there's something on one of my slides that really doesn't matter, I'd appreciate it. It's a little hard to kind of get into a good discussion with the PowerPoint slide without me being able to see everybody in the room. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Great. So a little bit more about these programs. There are 11 or 12, depending on how you count, participating federal agencies that provide this funding, essentially anyone that does research in the federal government. These names should be familiar to most of you. The Department of Defense is by far the largest, and they fund essentially anything that's going to help them achieve their mission of helping the warfighter. And they're literally over $1 billion, literally over half of all of the grants and contracts made. Someone was talking also about some biology, some healthcare stuff. NIH is a good agency. It's not the only one that funds healthcare, but certainly the largest. And then the rest of the agencies are listed down here, more or less in order of their size. Although if I did this to scale, DoD would be like half of the page, and then like EPA and NIST and NOAA wouldn't even be visible. They would just be like tiny 6-point font at the bottom. So the budgets, as well as some of the way the programs are implemented, really vary by agency. All right, so I already kind of explained what SBIR stands for. A little bit more information about the program. The SBIR, which is often referred to as the whole program, it's by far the larger one, as well as the sister program, STTR, are really one big umbrella set of rules and guidelines for all 12 of these agencies. SBIR is the largest. It's always done with a small business. It could be done with a university, but it doesn't have to. And it is $2 billion of that $2.8 billion funding. The money is yours to keep. It's non-dilutive to spend on whatever you want. And the government, depending on which agency, will issue the funding as issue the award as either a grant or a contract. And there are some differences that are kind of outside the scope of the presentation. In some cases, they're basically the same thing, but in general, a grant, you have more discretion of what you're going to spend the money on. A contract, like any federal contract, is a lot more specific. So as I said, STTR is kind of a smaller sister program under the same umbrella. It's only about 0.4% of agency budgets, and as a result, only the larger agencies have an STTR program. And a key thing, and I won't spend too much time on STTR, because I think most of you may not be too relevant. It absolutely must include a university or another research institution like a federal lab as a partner. Sometimes the tech is being spun off from the university or the federal lab. Sometimes it's just a professor that's been integrally involved with the development. But as you spend money, as you measure the budget, 30% of the budget has to be spent at the university. Okay, so I'd like to kind of pause and bring this down to real world terms. So some of you are, I'm sure most of you are interested in money, except the hypothetical, really wealthy inventor. But why should you apply? Why is this good? And why is this particular program useful? Well, the first thing, as I mentioned, it's non-dilutive. How many people know what dilutive or a non-dilutive investment is? Anybody want to say?
I could guess, but better not.
You're welcome to guess. Go ahead, take a try. What does it mean if somebody invests in your company and it dilutes the company?
That they have some kind of ownership of it?
Exactly. That's what a venture capital investor or even an angel is going to do. They're going to get some kind of terms that give them partial ownership. Some VCs actually ask for a seat on the board and a degree of executive management control. They start pulling the strings. Unlike VCs, SBIR funding is yours to keep with very few, if no strings attached to data rights or IP. So you're getting this money, you can spend it on salaries, materials and supplies, rent, analytical services, testing, whatever you really want. You can pay yourself benefits, you can take a small fee. It is fully non-dilutive and does not need to be paid back, and you have discretion about where to spend it. Probably even more important than what the funding is like is what it's for, is that if you go to a typical investor and say you have a really high-risk invention, they're going to say, come back when it's fully proven and you've got buyers lined up, and then we'll invest. The government is the exact opposite. They want to see these inventions to the point where the risk is minimized, the risk is lowered, and an inventor or a small business has an innovation that's ready to go to market that's brought to market by the SBIR funds, and then they'd like the private sector to pick it up. So again, it goes to the concept of America's seed funding innovation. I mentioned you retain intellectual property. For some of the contracting agencies, they would like to buy the technology afterwards, and they do have certain rights, but you are the owner, whether or not you have a patent, and the government cannot simply steal your invention. And this is all kept, your proposal and your research results are kept confidential. And finally, if you get an award from the government, if you get an award from one of these agencies, it's evidence of external credibility. It's validation from an external source. And very often this makes you a little more attractive to a private equity-oriented investor. Is that clear so far?
Yeah.
All right, so I mentioned that like all the agencies have slight differences, and some of them are beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today. There are three things that are common, or at least very similar, between all 12 of the agencies. And that's the fact that the funding is granted or awarded in three separate phases. Of course, the first one's phase one. That's really a feasibility of an invention. Typically at this stage, an inventor might have some kind of theoretical basis or model, or they've prototyped a few little subsystems, but really have not demonstrated that the technology is feasible. That's what the government gives phase one funding for. It's usually 6 months. Some agencies are now allowing 12 that you have to spend the money in, and the average award is about $150,000. Phase two, which of course is after phase one, is more like the development or prototyping. In the case where you've done your feasibility and you maybe did your R&D on a benchtop scale or lab scale, the phase two is really about a pilot scale or perhaps doing studies in representative conditions or integrating subsystems. In the case of like ag, I know some people in the group have algae and agriculture livestock experience. We can talk about a little more later. In the case of agriculture, very often phase two, where phase one was like a lab or like a seed test in a benchtop scale, phase two is actually doing something out in the field, maybe with a larger sample size of animals or a 100-liter tank of growing algae. It's essentially all the development and wringing out all of the fine-tuning and invention so that you're ready to go to phase three with no funding, and you're essentially just doing manufacturing and marketing activities in phase three.
100 liters, that's all?
Oh, I mean, it depends on what process you're talking about.
Yeah.
If you're talking pharmaceuticals, 100 liters is practically manufacturing scale.
Sure.
But yeah, if you're extracting something from an algae, maybe whatever is a reasonable pilot scale that will essentially allow you to do all of the debugging. And phase two is also quite a lot longer and quite a lot more money, up to $1 million and up to 24 months. So the bad news, unfortunately, is that everyone has to start at phase one with very, very, really rare exceptions. Phase one is really kind of a lot more competitive. It's kind of the icebreaker getting into the government. Once they award you, they really want to see the technology continue. And as a result, it's much, once you get your phase one, you get to talk to program managers, you get some feedback on your results, the award rate goes up. Now, remember, you've already been vetted in phase one. Phase two awards are typically 1 in 3. So the conversion rate is about one out of every 3 phase ones gets awarded in the phase two. All right. So this is kind of getting to the end of all the technical mumbo jumbo, the jargon. So eligibility, I don't think this is really much of a stretch for any of you here. You have to be in the U.S. You have to be majority owned in the U.S. Can't be bigger than 500 employees. Anyone in the room who has more than 500 employees?
No.
It does give you an idea you're going to be competing against some larger companies. And you have to do all the work in the U.S., including any prototyping. You can buy materials outside the U.S., but you have to kind of justify them. So on the one takeaway from this slide, I don't know, has anyone ever worked in a university situation or applied for other grants, non-federal grants before?
No. And we applied for one grant, right?
Which grant?
It was for an energy grant, I think, for that algae.
Oh, cool. Was it your small business doing it?
Yeah. Small.
Cool. It's a little hard to see who's talking.
Yeah, that's me, Eric.
Oh, okay. Eric, do you work? Are you an employee or an owner of the algae company?
Yeah, I'm a co-owner with Bob.
Oh, cool. Okay. Okay, well, I don't know what the terms of that grant were, but the SBIR STTR programs are the only programs where it has to be a business. It can't be a nonprofit. It can't be a university. It can't be a non-governmental organization like a consortium or an economic development entity. You have to be a small business. And so this eliminates like 2/3 of the competition that you would have if you just went for a general announcement. That is a really big deal. I have to tell you, I've seen a lot of grants that companies are interested in where 90% of them go to of the awards go to universities. So this is a nice little bit of protection, despite the fact that it is still a very competitive program.
Yeah, we've been an LLC for what, 3-4 years now.
Yeah, an LLC is definitely one form of small business. Some C or S corps are the more common, but you just have to have some kind of article of incorporation. And in fact, sole proprietors can even apply, but by the time they have an award, the government would like to see a small business be in existence.
How long does it take from application to an award if one gets one? What is the time period?
The answer is it really depends, and they're trying to shorten it, but it can be 4 to 6 months. So if you look at, I'll talk a little bit later. I don't have a huge amount of content, and I'd recommend you do go to SBIR.gov. But since you're interested, depending on the agency, there's kind of a very specific window they have, once, twice, or 3 times a year. They don't accept just random proposals unsolicited. So you have to time to that. And then generally I recommend at least 3 months, not full time, but just getting all your ducks in a row to apply. So adding that timing, 3 months, and then waiting 4 or 5 months for the award, and then you have, you have to spread it out over a year. Very often, you're really looking at funding that should be really for a new product, not something you're dying to get to market in the next 6 months. All right, so I talked about eligibility, moving on a little bit, and I'd be glad to come back to questions. So I kind of talked about who's eligible and why you should apply, but the question is, is it a good idea? Will you be competitive, and is it really right for your invention or company? So some critical things, distilling down, hundreds of solicitations and hundreds of proposals I've worked on, 3 or 4 common elements that should be considered is that your company or your invention should be innovative in a way that has never been done before, doesn't exist now, and it meets the needs of the agency you're seeking funding from. What constitutes innovative is really a judgment call depending on the needs of the agency. For instance, USDA has a lot of rural development funding, and their mission is to get economic development, keep the rural communities alive. They're not looking for you to bring nuclear fusion or, a NASA space base to a rural area. If you have some great, say, an algae biofuel that you want to ramp up in a rural area, the bar is lower at USDA for the degree of innovation, as long as there's a need that the rural community has is met.
Is it also limited to, let's say if you want to add some current technology that can be applied to other areas, does that qualify as well?
It really depends, and again, it depends on the agency. Generally, if you're just like very, very low risk adapting something to, let's say there's some vaccine you've developed or some natural animal healthcare product, and it works on sheep, and now you're trying it on horses by tweaking the formula, probably not going to get a lot of funding, but the original formula development might. So it really depends. On the other hand, if you're totally reinventing this, and there's a very high degree of innovation in moving to that different application, then yes, it would definitely be good. And especially if you can protect the business, protect the intellectual property in what you're doing in the new application. All right, so moving along, not in any particular order, but the reviewers in the agency are going to look at your overall team, whether they're qualified and you have resources like space, equipment, access to test facilities, Like if you're an agricultural person, that you have access to test fields or seed science testing labs or a veterinary kind of test facility. That's another thing that you should definitely consider if you're doing how you would have access to that. And then in particular, every SBIR grant and STTR grant, much like a lot of research grants, use the terminology principal investigator, the person who is a lead investigator, and that person has to be technically qualified to do whatever it is the agency is looking for and what you're proposing to do. So typically, but not always, this is a PhD or an MD, particularly in healthcare. If you're doing something with nuclear physics at Department of Energy, you probably better have a PhD nuclear physicist. On the other hand, I keep picking on USDA, but in some areas, USDA is very much looking for like a degreed veterinarian or a PhD in crop or soil science to do this research. However, again, if you're doing something that has very broad applications, field experience is looked at as well, but you really want someone who's demonstrated their ability either through education or previous experience in a related or adjacent field. And very often it's not necessary, the person has to be an employee, but it's not necessary the person is an employee at the time of the proposal. You can make a contingent offer to someone. Say, if I get this funding, Mr. Electrical Engineer, will you come work on my circuit board design? These are small business grants. Unlike a university grant, you do have to demonstrate that there's a market and a customer and a path to do what you're commercializing. Most people are kind of good at envisioning this in principle, but typically an SBIR grant requires phase one would require, depending on the agency, again, a 1 to 4 page discussion of the commercial potential, how you would get the product to market, how you might get funding, and how much funding that would be, what your potential revenue and operating margins would be. Some like Department of Defense hardly looks at that. In phase one, National Institute of Health doesn't. National Science Foundation, oddly enough, wants something really innovative, but they want you to have talked to customers and to have a really solid development plan. So they almost have a split personality at National Science Foundation. All right, so that was all I had about SBIR content. I'll talk a little more about resources in a minute, but this is a good point for any questions if anybody wants. All right, so if you've decided this is something you at least want to explore some more, there are a few resources in Oregon I can mention that can help. I work at one of them. So I haven't really said what Oregon Best is. I'll do so now. I work on contract for this entity, which is essentially a clean tech economic development consortium. It's called Oregon Best. And within Oregon Best, we have what we call the SBIR, STTR Support Center. It's been in existence for about 4 years now, and we provide a variety of things, specific grant writing, proposal writing, and training on proposals for companies who already know what they want to apply for and which agency. Funding opportunity searches and help matching a solicitation if you don't. And then a lot of ad hoc consulting on how to meet the sometimes complicated guidelines of eligibility, meeting all the requirements in a proposal, making sure you register with all the government systems. We provide all of that, whether it's one-on-one training or one-on-one consulting, or once a year we have a training class, or sometimes we have some small seminars. And I should have mentioned, next week, actually, this date is wrong, it's the 19th, but so a week from Monday, we're starting an in-depth workshop class for companies that kind of have a solicitation and a topic and an agency already identified and want to actually start preparing a proposal for one of the deadlines later this year. And you can learn more by going to our website, which has both the class information and much more information about SBIR, STTR in general, and the services we provide in particular.
Yeah, I'd just like to mention that I'm going to put this presentation up on our website so
Yeah.
they can take a look at
Oh, cool.
it. And also, I have this presentation recorded, so I'm going to edit it a little bit. So if there's any confidential thing, I won't.
There's nothing confidential on my part, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying if anybody says something at the end, that's fine.
Yeah, I wanted to mention a couple things also. So Oregon Best is clean tech, but they were allowed to create this SBIR, STTR Support Center with some state support, state funding, under the caveat that this support is available to all startups with a technology-oriented innovation, not just clean tech, so medical, defense, electronics, really anything. Clean tech is very broad. You know, most people think of renewable energy or environmental stuff, and that is a lot of what BEST does and where some of their expertise lies, but I'll help anybody. The second thing I wanted to mention is all of this is free of charge to qualifying companies, including the class and any one-on-one consulting. So there is, I mean, the good news is it's all free. Sometimes I'm the primary provider of this. Sometimes at deadline time, I can get pretty bottlenecked with a lot of different priorities. So, you know, I'm not going to come and help you spend 50 hours writing a proposal for you, but there are some potential resources that are available to help do that, sometimes for a fee that I can recommend. All right. So that was the two things on this. And Oregon Best is funded. It's quasi-officially a state agency, but it's a nonprofit that just receives funding from the state. We're not state employees. However, the state of Oregon itself does provide direct funding to Oregon small businesses that are seeking SBIRs. They have what's called a Phase 0 program where they will give you, they don't provide a lot of any consulting or help, but if you apply and get accepted to this, they will provide you up to $5,000 reimbursement for anything relating to help prepare an SBIR STTR proposal. That could be hiring a grant writer like me. It could be going to a conference, not even an SBIR conference, but potentially like going to a ag tech conference or something. It could even cover some preliminary research or customer discovery work. So it's a really good resource. It is almost used up, and the biennium in the Oregon State Legislature, the budget's being approved this month and starts next month. I know that they've requested a continuation of this, and over the biennium, they will potentially have $1 million for this program. For the phase 0. So how many times does 5,000 go into $1 million? Can anybody do the math? I think it's 200 or something. So they can make up to 200 of these awards, and typically they're underutilized. So I recommend it, and this website can tell you how to apply. The other thing, if you're lucky enough to either get a Phase 1 grant, or the state of Oregon will actually match it. That is, they will provide up to $50,000. If you get, say, $150 from a National Science Foundation, they will match that up, bonus that with $50,000 more dollars, and you can spend that on things that wouldn't have been eligible under the SBIR grant, like market discovery, focus groups, marketing, legal. Getting a patent is probably the most common thing. You can't apply for attorney fees under SBIR, but you could use this matching grant for that. So anyway, this is it's currently not available. There's $2 million proposed in the Oregon budget. Keep your fingers crossed that it will actually be budgeted for by the legislature. So like I said, Business Oregon is a little bit more of a hands-off approach. They just kind of provide the cash, and you have to kind of go out and find your own assistance services. And this is not limited. You can get a grant writer out of state if you want. And then finally, even though Arlene's not here, I have to mention the services that the SBDC provides, or she would have whacked me through the monitor. So how many people, I know you guys are actually in the Southwest Oregon Community College building. How many of you have either talked to Arlene specifically about some aspect of your business planning? Show of hands, maybe? Okay. Thanks, Webbs. You guys have been really quiet on the other end of the camera there.
We're more listeners than lecturers.
Well, no, there's another set of viewers, Michelle Webb, and I think her sister probably.
Oh, okay.
Say hi.
Hi.
Okay.
Oh, there are other people.
See? Anyway, so they provide a lot of general advice, like forming a company. If you don't have an LLC, Arlene can coach you on that. Business planning. They are part of the network of 19 SBDCs across the state. And in particular, like the one in Medford can help you with access to a lot of data on customers in Oregon and nationally, and other market research in some selected areas like food and beverages. So there's a lot of services, and in particular, they have some level of assistance and coaching for SBIR. It is largely centered in the Mount Hood Community College with a woman named Kedma who has experience with SBIR. I don't exactly know how much hands-on counseling she's doing.
She actually gave a presentation to our group too.
Oh no, did she talk a lot about SBIR?
No. Actually,
Okay, good. I didn't want to be too redundant or say something that
no, trust me.
stepped on her toes. So we're actually in the process of developing something we call Train the Trainers, where we're trying to get a little more local expertise across the state to kind of do a basic intake and tell you more about the SBIR program and do kind of a triage of technical merit, tell you where you can go to potentially do some research, either market research or getting some peer reviews on the subject you're in. And then essentially act as a funnel to some of the more in-depth SBIR training resources. I don't know if Arlene will take that, but I do know that the SBDCs are kind of signed up across the state to provide more of that. And so there may be an increase in the amount of coaching you can get there. But so the idea is to kind of help you in this formative phase of looking at agencies, deciding if this is right for you, and then it may lead into a referral either to the support center where I work, or you may decide to go it yourself and get a phase 0 grant. And I'm really curious, I do recommend, especially on the market discovery side or the business planning side, that some of you, if you haven't already, like kind of created some commercial evaluation of what your product would sell for and how many customers there are, try to do some of that through the SBDCs. All right. So this was all I had. I wish you luck in deciding if this is right for you, and I can be available by email after this.
So how many agencies, I mean, is it like 10, like you listed USDA, like Department of Defense, all of those? I mean, is it like 50 agencies who have money available? Or like how many?
No, it is, this list is totally complete.
Okay.
Can you see the slide again that I went back to?
That whole list is complete, I guess.
Yeah, so depending, NOAA and NIST are both part of the Department of Commerce, so they count as one. So if you do that, there's 11. I think they're all on this slide, right?
Right.
How many people are actually the decision makers? Say we submitted a grant, how many people are going to look at it and say yay or nay? Is it 1, 5, 10, 100?
Well, there's no easy answer, and the answer to all of your questions is it depends on which agency. So most of all of the granting agencies and some of the contracting agencies do a peer review on phase 1s. They do a screen for kind of the basic requirements and just the fundamentals of like, have you submitted all of the required elements? That's usually done by the administrative staff at the agency. There's a program manager at the agency, and then there's a peer review panel. So, and that peer review are people usually not from the agency, usually from academia or industry. And there's usually 3 technical reviewers, 3 or 4 in the first for phase 1. And for phase 2, there's 2 technical and 2 commercial reviewers. But again, it really varies by agency. Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, I think NASA, they only do internal reviews, especially NASA, they have so many scientists there. But typically, it's a very formal review process with standard criteria.
I noticed one of the requirements is to do a big portion of the work domestically. I work on a lot of programs where the program leader is not even a U.S. national. So, I hear what you're telling us, but, it doesn't perhaps mesh with what I've seen out in industry and reality.
That is really hard. Very often people do want to do R&D with an offshore company, and even some of the manufacturing if they're getting some prototypes made. All I can say, you can try to justify it with a program manager, but if you put yourself in the role of a U.S. taxpayer, believe it or not, they actually do want to try to spend taxpayer money wisely. And I see a lot of rigor with that at the agencies. Was there another question?
No.
James?
Yeah.
Well,
All right. So presumably by this point, you've formed some opinion about whether.
No, one more question.
Okay, go ahead.
What I see is agricultural, and do you do mechanical inventions?
Yes.
It really varies again by agency. It's not by technical discipline. For instance, if you have some kind of mechanical engineering farm equipment or perhaps robotic pesticide application that's heavily mechanical engineering oriented, there's a lot going on with drones and propulsion systems. That certainly could be done at USDA. Mechanical is done, Department of Defense, National Science Foundation. I wish I had more time. I could show you some typical topics, but if you go to these agency websites, you can see a little bit more about what they fund and what a given solicitation or call for proposals asks for.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Years ago, SBIR, you got a big old book in the mail twice a year or 3 times a year. And it listed all of the areas that the government was interested in supporting. And if you had an idea outside of those areas, it was pretty difficult to get an SBIR to pick it up. There might, as I recall, several thousand different projects amongst the agencies, but those were their areas of interest that they would fund. If your project didn't fit that, it was pretty hard to get anywhere. Is that still true? Or are they looking for more open-ended requests for proposal?
That's a great question. They certainly do everything online now. And these solicitations, I don't have a slide on this, but I can send something. These call for proposals or solicitations kind of replace that. The Department of Defense does it 3 times a year. It's very hard to get a contracting agency to accept an unsolicited proposal unless, or a proposal on a topic they're not requesting. But there are ways you can, if you have a way to understand the needs and a connection with one of these agencies, you can potentially propose other topics and have a chance at being awarded. It really depends, again, on the agency. The granting agencies are much more open to your idea. USDA and National Science Foundation in particular, they just publish very broad lists of topic areas. And again, as long as it's kind of for National Science Foundation on their, if it's innovative, for USDA, if it's on the mission of agriculture, they will accept, you know, non-solicited or a topic that's not listed explicitly. But you are in some ways fighting an uphill battle.
Another question in that area. How many, there's two approaches to this. One, you have an idea in a business you're going to build. Then you look to SBIR to see if something fits. The other approach is go through the SBIR list, say I've got expertise here, I want to attack that particular.
You want to bid on something, yeah.
Which is the most popular? Which is the most successful?
You know, I would say that both approaches can work, but if you really don't have any expertise and you're just essentially bidding on a project, it really depends more. I couldn't see who was talking, but we can find out. I can find out a little more what you do later. But it really depends on what you want to do with your invention or your technology, and you know, you can really go far afield. You know, honestly, even $500,000 is not a lot of money if you're going to do something that you never wanted to do and you don't want to build a business on. It's just going to detour you from what your mission and your goal is in running your business and getting to market. So there has to be some alignment between the topic and what you were going to do anyway. But generally, I've seen more success in companies who take the long view, and this is already something they're doing, and either they write a very good proposal to a granting agency, or they're patient and they work with some of the entities that do contracting and get a better understanding of what the agency's looking for, and then they get then they wait until the solicitation's there. But very often that requires patience. All right, I think I should probably move on. I do want to have time for more general questions at the end. And like I said earlier, we will potentially be coming to the South Coast Development Center later in the year for a live presentation. And there'd probably be some one-on-ones afterwards where we could have a little bit better than over-the-camera presentation and Q&A. You know, I can look at maybe a little bit more of your material, but I have at least 10 more minutes, and I'd be glad to answer as many questions as I can in those 10 minutes or follow up afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, Leon.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to try to actually see who's talking now. By the way, Eric, you're like off camera in case you were wondering.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, you have to, lean in.
I'm on camera. There you go.
There you go, that's better.
So,
Blame the camera.
yeah.
Actually, I can move it a little bit.
You know, one general question I have of everyone in this room, what sort of help would everyone really want or need? So what's your top priority? Is it training, is it money, and you know, how much work do you put in yourself on a project?
So are you asking me, or are you asking, I couldn't hear the question.
Well, I
He was asking the group.
he was asking the group of what kind of help.
Okay.
Do they really need and want? In other words, training is certainly helpful, and there's a lot of rules of thumb out there for
Right.
how much markup you need in a product. If you have less than that, you're going to get in trouble or jail. So there's a lot of guidelines like that, but then I'm trying to find out what specific types of help. Is it technical? Is it marketing? Do most people need from the inventors group?
I'll let the,
Well, I think the group that's here, we're pretty much seasoned personnel that have worked in large corporations and been through the battering ram, so to speak. And if anything, most of us are filters for other folks coming in and saying, you know, here's my invention and everything like that. And then we explain to them the hard knocks of what's going on, you know, and what you need to do. Just as simply as Googling a patent or just Googling the product itself. We've had that a couple of times where people come in and saying that they got the, you know, the best product in the whole wide world and this, that, and the other thing. And it took us 5 minutes on Google to find about 10 other items that are similar to that and selling cheaper. So, I mean, we've run into that. I myself, you know, like I said, I've been in research for 18 years. I've worked for some large corporations, so I've worked on 17 patents and both optical and mechanical designs and things like that. So I get a pretty good sense of what need and then what effort it takes to get a product from a concept into production, into the concept and things like that, the semi-production, full production, and having experience with that. So I mean that's why I'm asking more. So the questions I would ask more would be how to write the proposals and things like that, because I've dealt with corporations like, you know, GDS Uniphase, Allergan, and Smithkline Beecham and all that. We just make a proposal for a research or project, and either, you know, the board says yes or no, and, you know, we get money, or we just get, or sometimes we do it under the radar of the department, which has happened a few times. So, but so that would be more from my perspective, exactly. That's where the question of tying in with somebody who has, you know, similar experiences or more experience than I in developing these products. And like I said, I probably have more experience with what they would do, and if anything, that wouldn't be so much holding my hand as much as I would be holding their hand, trying to explain to them what it is that I'm trying to do. So, but I think just writing out the proposal would be the biggest thing for myself.
I do have a question for people here. What's like the average cost of getting help with a grant? I mean, is it $100, $1,000, $200 to get a grant written or at least helped on for first timer or something like that?
Well, so that Business Oregon Phase 0 grant I mentioned, that $5,000 is pretty much a benchmark.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
For Phase 1, and most most companies can't really afford a Phase 1 grant writer, do it themselves. So that's why the Phase 0 program exists.
Oh, okay.
But you don't have to spend that. I mean, you can. There's probably easier ways to do parts yourself and then get, you know, a review or just pay by the hour. Typically in my field, grant writers are getting at least $100 an hour.
Okay, so like I would write a grant and then I would submit it to you, and for $100 you would say you need to fix this, this, and this, or thumbs up.
Yeah, generally. I mean, we're talking now about proposal preparation, so there's a lot of steps. I could teach like a whole 4-hour class. You know, there's looking at, you know, you might ask me to critique it just purely based on the writing style and the compliance with the government requirements, or you could ask me more to look at the actual subject matter and whether or not you've made a convincing argument for, you know, why what you're doing is going to be innovative and why it's a good business. So that could be more than just like a 1-hour consult, especially since I'm not a subject matter expert in everything.
Sure.
You know, generally, if you're just talking reviews, it's better to get is the guy with the black baseball hat one of the Bobs?
Yeah.
In the front, yeah. As Bob mentioned, you know, you almost want to find other people who have field subject matter expertise who've brought, like, say, an optical product to market and get them to look at that proposal, if not be an advisor prior to that. So there's a lot of different aspects. We just don't, the main purpose of today's presentation is just to kind of get everybody's feet wet and start thinking, is this right for them?
Yeah. I just want people to have a basic understanding on, you know, what you know, the first steps. Like if I found something, oh, this looks good for, I can like, you know, for energy, or I see a way that I can save, you know, power by, you know, doing this kind of insulation or that kind of insulation, or
Right.
kind of crop technology or something like that. what basic things just for the proposal itself and what would I need for it and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I think this would be tremendously helpful for, like, as we had a couple of times, inventors come in here and they have spent either the life savings or put a mortgage on the house or something like that.
Yeah.
And I would rather, and point them in this direction to where we would say basically check your marketing first before you start running off. But if you find that this is an area, this would be, to me, a step for somebody to go into to get, I would say, finalization or verification that the product is worthy of an innovation in a sense.
Yeah.
We've had people come in who basically had a child who was sick, a particular thing, that basically it was a touch type of product that they were attaching to their child. And they've seen other children that had similar things and they wanted to go off and make this at home in their own laboratory. And I told them, no, we can't do that because you need FDA approval and anything happens physically. As soon as you touch somebody with something or a needle or anything like that, you're already, in trouble. And they weren't aware of that fact. They were looking at it from the emotional point of view, which is fine, but they didn't realize that there was this legal ratification that they had to go through. And I think something like this will give them somewhat of an eye opener, and to be able to approach and saying, okay, is this worthy to keep going on with their project? So to me, it would be a pathway for explaining to other people that if you have something that's viable, instead of running off and trying to get a patent on it or something like that, see if it's possible at this point in time. Doing the phase one, because like I said, most people come in and they say they want to patent this and then they want to license it to somebody, and then make their $1 million, and every year they're going to get the licensing. Well, that's not realistic. Whereas in this sense, it's more realistic about what it's going to do.
Yeah, even to get, honestly, the world has become so complicated. Even just to license something requires it to take to a certain stage of technical readiness, and you're licensing certain applications or you're allowing the person to do continual R&D. It's a very rare to just really prove something in a lab and then say, open it up for bidding. There has to be some additional investment.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you're right. I like to say, you're talking about the overall continuum of product development. And I like to kind of look at preparing these proposals, not necessarily even just for SBIR, but like for preparing a pitch to an investor. You sort of want to have a 3-month process in stages I look at as kind of, stage 1 is kind of your strategy and your fundamentals, making all your decisions. And so, you were asking, and I'd love to hear more from the group about where they think they need help. Some of those fundamentals, if you haven't decided which application you're going to go to, like which market and who your customers are, and whether you're going to, sell directly to them, or if you're going to license your, agricultural your agricultural chemical ingredient to Monsanto or somebody. If you don't make those big decisions, very often you can't even design an R&D plan. You can't even design the product. You have to kind of do those basics. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to write a good proposal around it. It's just not going to sound good. So I always suggest people spend like a month in that, identifying what resources it would take to do research in this area, kind of putting together some strategic partnerships and advisors. Then month 2 is really kind of creating the content. And this is where like doing market research at the SBDCs might help, doing the patent search you mentioned and right to use, freedom to operate, or doing technical research. And then really the last stage, doing the detailed English major stuff, that's, if you've done all the homework, that's really just like a one-night project, like a term paper. But just like a term paper, if you haven't gone to the library and looked at the books, you're going to have a really hard time pulling an all-nighter to write your term paper. writing an SBIR proposal, I didn't mention this, but the narrative portion is only 15 pages. It's pretty much a limit at every agency. There's tons of like a budget and letters of support and stuff, tons of supplemental documentation. But the 15 pages isn't that hard to write if you've got a list of all the competitors and a list of all the previous research in the area and your kind of experiment written down. Then it's just a matter of committing it to paper. So as people move forward and think about like where are they ready and what stage their product is developed to, or your invention, you know, that's how to think about what you need. It's like, have you made your basic strategy decisions for your whole product development plan from, you know, your idea? You're probably at some level of feasibility or proving it physically. How are you going to get it all the way to market? How does it have to be tested? Who's going to manufacture it? Getting a lot of those things figured out up front will avoid a lot of pain downstream.
Question on the SBIRs. That list used to come out and it would be open for a certain period of time, then it would close as they reviewed proposals. Then they would come out with a new list. I think it was twice a year or 3 times. Are they still doing that? And what's the current schedule?
Hang on, I can pull up the schedule in a few minutes if I can look fairly quickly. So the schedule is probably too complicated to even answer your question in one slide. That's what I say at everything, right?
That's the government.
That's the government. Yeah. You don't, who in the room really expects 12 different branches of the federal government to do everything exactly the same and all of them to agree?
Just look at Congress, right?
Yeah. Can't even get 2 branches of Congress to agree on stuff.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment on our algae farm. When we started, we were aiming at oil production and energy production. And as time went by, we got more information and found out that that was really pretty much cost prohibitive. So our focus has changed more for algae, for supplements, for cosmetics, things like that. So kind of you got to keep your eye on what you're doing, and your target may change, and you got to kind of keep up with the changes.
Okay, here we go. Can you all see this chart that says application timing?
Yes.
Okay.
Small chart.
Yeah, so this is just the top 5 agencies. And again, it's sometimes called a request for proposals or solicitation or funding opportunity announcement, but it's all basically the same. As there's an announcement with the fundable projects and some descriptions that vary by agency and specificity, or whether it's a grant or contract. Department of Energy does things twice a year in 2 releases, once in July through October and one in November through February. DOD, like I said, is the biggest. They have 3. HHS, Health and Human Services, which is National Institute of Health, have 1 list of topics, 1 call for proposals. They have 3 windows you can apply in. And then at the end of that 3rd window, then they close that whole announcement and release a new solicitation with new topics. So it really varies, whoever asked the question. I work a lot with National Science Foundation. A lot of clean tech funding comes from there, and a lot of the electronics and software that's going on in Portland right now. Internet of Things and autonomous vehicles is being funded by NSF. Cybersecurity, some stuff there. So they change their topics very little from year to year, and they're open twice. They just have an announcement. It's open at the same day. There's like 3.5 months, and then the deadline closes. So hopefully this gives you a sense for how much it varies. And the smaller agencies really only tend to be once a year. USDA is open in the fall, or actually USDA will open in July. Michelle, pay attention. USDA will open their list of topics in July, and I've heard there's going to be some changes this year to the list of topics, and they're actually open. USDA is open for 4 months, and then the solicitation, the proposals are due, and the solicitation closes around October 5th. But if you miss it this year, you've missed it. You have to wait until October of 2018. So it really all varies. The smaller agencies just don't have enough money to give out awards throughout the year. USDA is about a $20 million agency. National Science Foundation has about $150 million between their phase 1 and phase 2. So it really all depends.
How many companies in Oregon are on the SBIR program?
Oh, darn. I knew you were going to ask that. I have another slide, but I haven't memorized the numbers. I think in Oregon, there have been about 2,000 awards made to about 350 companies since the program started. And well, actually, the data I have only goes back to about 2003. So that's like since 2003. So Oregon actually does reasonably well per capita. We're like in the middle of the pack, relative, per citizen nationwide. Obviously, California itself is so huge that it gets like 30% of the overall national funding from all the agencies. But per capita, California is not even one of the higher states. Maryland, Massachusetts, Virginia, maybe not Virginia, but like North Carolina, they're like cleaning up because of all the universities and tech industries there, especially some of the DoD stuff around the DC area. So Oregon's kind of in the middle of the pack. My job exists because we'd like to do better and raise the number of proposals submitted and raise the overall quality. Some of the really underserved per capita states, there's some in the South, like Alaska, Idaho, Nevada. They're all really underserved, and they get a considerably lower percentage than some of these really tech-heavy, industry-heavy states.
Is there any, I would say, the lack of a better word, favoritism towards a rural area like we are, to where it's the trying to get Coos County or Curry County, whatever it is, up to kind of off from the lumber and everything else that we do around here, and hopefully get into other things? Is there a benefit to that, or is it a disadvantage?
Well, at the federal level, so the answer is in the review process and the awarding process, they try to be as neutral as possible.
Okay.
Again, it goes back to that list: technical merit, commercial merit, strength of the team. However, where you're going to see help is that like entities like Oregon Best, entities like Business Oregon are going to provide assistance services more to some of these underserved regions. And that's actually what the South Coast Development Center is supposed to be doing. They got this it changed its name. It used to be called the Rural Opportunity Development. I think it's called the Rural Outreach Initiative now or something. But they have funding to train entrepreneurs, both tech and non-tech. Do you guys, I know Coos Bay is not huge. Do you even know what I'm mentioning with the South Coast Development Center?
Are you talking about Quebec? What was your question? I didn't quite get it.
Okay, from what I know, there's state rural economic development money going in Coos Bay to this South Coast Development Center. Arlene could probably tell you a little more about it. I can send Eric the address of this and the people who are running it, but they're supposed to be essentially providing training and other resources, like possibly an accelerator program for rural entrepreneurs.
I've taken some of the classes that Arlene and other folks have given here.
So that's not what this initiative is. So Eric, if you don't mind, I'll send you a link to this.
Yeah.
If you could forward to the group.
Please do.
Because, like I said, they just had a management turnover. I think why we didn't come was it's still too early. But hopefully later in the year or next year, they'll be ramping up services. I don't know. I mean, some of these rural outreach entities have actually been creating incubators where companies can rent cheap office space and potentially have lab or, you know.
Yeah, Arlene mentioned there's a guy named Sean Gibbs, and he has.
Yeah. That's it. Sean is that person. He think he was or she was the director of the South Coast Development Center, or she's just coming in now.
Yeah, but I sent him an email mainly because Arlene said he was talking about some kind of like makerspace or
Yeah.
area. Because I wanted, you know, one of the things is I want to help people with prototypes, and you know, if we have everything under there, we can take, you know, people have the idea, they come here, they discuss it, and then they go over to there, you know, for help with the basic prototype, like getting a mold or something like that. And that's where I want to get to with us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would love to come down when that's, I don't know what their tactics are, if they're, you know, they're makerspace or they're providing some other lab equipment.
I haven't got back to me yet, but I sent him an email, so we'll see what happens later on.
Yeah, sorry I don't have more information. I was hoping Arlene would be here to mention that.
Yeah, I'll talk to her too about some of this stuff as well.
Yeah.
A question on, they used to have a business commerce daily, and segments in there would be requests for proposal for different projects, similar to SBIR.
Mm-hmm.
Are they still doing that? And is it good to look at both when you're looking at a project?
You're talking about a business journal, or is there someplace you can look?
The federal government would publish
Okay.
daily a list of everything that they wanted to buy.
Okay. I could probably do a whole seminar on just this as well. So the short answer is both the Oregon Best website. It's getting a little late, so I don't want to try to go to all these different websites. The Oregon Best website for SBIR STTR Support Center has the current solicitations up on there. And then, but all it does is kind of summarize the solicitation and then gives you a link to go read it. The SBIR.gov national website also has something similar, but again, it doesn't like broadcast what the new topics are. If you really, really want to stay abreast of developments and get them as soon as they're released, there's two places you can go now. One is Fed BizOps, which literally, I mean, if the Army wants shoelaces for its boots, you know, they post that they have to post that contract for bid on Fed BizOps. And on Fed BizOps, you can, once there's sometimes forecasts or last year's announcement, you can ask to be updated and get a push a notification now by email based on a given topic area or a given funding announcement from past years. So that's for the contracting agencies. For the granting agencies, no surprise, there's an entity called grants.gov that legally has all of the grants from NSF, DOE, USDA. And again, they will push out an email notification to you once there's a new funding opportunity announcement. But the more you get, you know, the problem with these is like the Oregon Best website is very user-friendly, but it doesn't give you a lot of information and it doesn't get updated as frequently. Same thing for SBIR.gov. You have to sort of almost be using that as a fishing tool. The good thing about, you know, you'll get these Fed BizOps notifications, but the bad thing about them is you have to know what you're looking for because, you know, there's literally tens of thousands a day. So you have to enter the right keywords or the right agencies. So now you're kind of going on you're fishing on a much bigger sea. And if you don't know, like Health and Human Services, Community Economic Development, or NIST is releasing an SBIR solicitation, so I want to subscribe to that notification. If you don't know where to look and you enter the wrong keyword, you can easily miss something. So it's a much more powerful tool, but it's much less user-friendly.
Okay, well,
All right, I want to go eat dinner. Thank you very much. I hope to be down in Coos Bay later in the year.
thanks a lot, Leo.
Thank you.
And, I'd be glad either use my email or Eric, if Eric wants to just post a list of everybody that attended, I'd certainly be glad to be in touch.
Yeah, I'm gonna get all this stuff and all the links proposed and all that stuff, and as well as I'm gonna post our meeting too online.
Great. Well, it sounds like a really good group. I'm actually kind of curious. I especially, looks like the webs are still there. I especially want to hear about the hydroponics, Eric, you were talking about. And sounds like there's a good cluster of technology going on there.
Yeah, I'll actually send you some of my stuff that I have.
Okay. Right. I look forward to hearing about it.
Cover because a couple of people had some inventions or help. So that's what I'm going to leave the rest of the meeting up to.
Great. Thanks a lot, guys. Good night.
Yeah, enjoy your dinner.
Thank you.